Mr. President, and all the organizers and technical staff at the Fundación Rafael del Pino and Fundación Gaspar Casal. This event has three different titles. One is taken from the book. The three authors that are speaking today with us have been interviewed for, and the book is called Sociedad, entre pandemias, and so is the event. The other title for this event is also in Spanish, and it's COVID-19, Historia de una crisis. It stresses the interest in history that is the common denominator to our three speakers today. And it is also the best translation we could frankly come up of the third and original title, this time in English, for this round table, which is COVID-19, the making of a crisis. By this making of, we wanted to emphasize the cultural aspects of the COVID-19 global shock. Let me explain this. While the virus SARS-CoV-2 is a natural being, as are, of course, the effects it causes on the human body, the perception, handling, and the effects of the virus depend on a number of variables that are cultural as much as they are natural. Among these aspects, I want to emphasize today history, economics, and sociology. And luckily for us, our panelists today are amongst the most suitable people for the job. Let me introduce them to you in their order of appearance. Professor Lorraine Daston is a historian of science and former director of the Max Planck Institute of the History of Science. She is known for having advanced the field of historical epistemology through analysis of the historical changes of meanings of concepts such as observation, objectivity, and rules or laws. She was interviewed for Sociedad, entre pandemias by historian of science Sebastián Dutreuil, and there she emphasized the different ways in which natural and moral responsibility have been understood from the early modern period to basically the present pandemics. The second speaker is Adam Tooze from Columbia University. For historians of science, he's mostly very well known from his early work on statistics and the German state, as well as other important works on economic history. For many other people, including those in Fundación Rafael del Pino, who had the good taste of inviting him a couple of years ago, I think, he is very well known for his historical approach to the 2008 financial crisis. His contribution to the book Sociedad, entre pandemias was a dialogue with historian and sociologist of technology Lee Winsel. In it, Professor Tooze analyzed the different ways in which the COVID-19 pandemics is affecting global markets and geopolitical balances. Finally, Professor Jeffrey Alexander works at Yale University, where he's one of the most salient champions of cultural sociology, understood as an approach to culture which focuses on symbolism and meaning as relatively independent from the factuality of events. Among the many works in which he has developed this view, both theoretically and through practical examples, is his contribution to Sociedad, entre pandemias, in dialogue with philosopher and sociologist of philosophy Javier Pérez Jara. In that chapter, Alexander focuses on competing interpretations of viruses and vaccines across countries and regions. As speakers very well know, this quick summary of their contributions to the book does not at all mean that they need to stick to what they said there. Sorry. On the contrary, it is an invitation to just reflect and enrich the conversation on COVID-19 through the approaches of history, economic history, and cultural analysis of pandemics. It's nothing more, but also, of course, nothing less. So each speaker, starting with Professor Daston, will have 10 minutes, and then the three of them will engage in free conversation for another 10 or 15 minutes. And I will finally be taking questions from the website. So for those of you both in the physical and online audiences, please go there to the website and direct your questions there so I can read them. And without further ado, Rainy, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lino. As Lino said, I will be speaking from the perspective of a historian of science, and I'm going to start with how a disaster becomes a crisis, how it's made visible. Second, the diagnostic characteristics of this particular crisis. And third, its impact on science. So crisis is in the eye of the beholder, and still more in the hands of the decider. A crisis differs from a disaster like a major earthquake in at least two respects. First, a crisis is perceived to mark a critical juncture in human affairs, not just a mega misfortune like, for example, the 1978 Sichuan earthquake, devastating though that was. Second, a crisis, from the Greek word for decision, demands action, while a disaster may demand only mourning and monuments. To turn a disaster into a crisis implies making it part of the human plot, framing it in terms of responsibility and agency, and not just good or bad fortune. And for that reason, perception is key to the understanding of how a crisis is made into a crisis, how a disaster becomes a crisis. An event or situation must be framed as something that not only affects the human polity in grave ways, but also as something that is both potentially a turning point and also an occasion for obligatory action on the part of those who decide. So I'm going to start with perception, how a disaster becomes a crisis. And I think this is a claim which is hardly controversial. Without statistics, and especially graphically displayed statistics, there would arguably have been no COVID-19 crisis. There would still have been death and suffering on a global scale. But unfortunately, a great deal of death and suffering takes place on the global scale every year without triggering a crisis. That is an urgent and irresistible call for immediate action. What was needed to turn this particular disaster into a crisis was not only the counts of the number of infections and deaths, but, and this I think is the key point and the new point, a comparative scorecard of regions and nations ranked both within nations and internationally by how badly afflicted they were. So we're all familiar with these. Those of us who live in cities like Berlin or Madrid or New York, every morning would be confronted on the front page of the local newspaper with the number of infections per 100,000. Almost every major news outlet in countries throughout at least the Western world and beyond updated its national and international statistics on an hourly basis. And finally, there were the heat maps that made even those who stumbled perhaps over the numbers all too aware of who was doing well and who was doing badly. So you could see at a glance which countries were managing well, so New Zealand in palest pink, and which were managing badly, the United States in blood red magenta. To underscore the aspect of national competition in crisis management, the units on these world maps were nation states, however little sense that made from an epidemiological standpoint. Had the numbers been presented as worldwide totals, they still would have made the spread of the virus and its mounting toll and mortality visible. But by presenting the numbers on a nation by nation or a region by region basis, these maps and statistical tallies turned disaster into a crisis in which leaders were called upon not only to console the victims, as they might have, for example, after a volcanic eruption or tsunami, but to act, and to act in full awareness that they were being judged not only against their domestic political rivals, but against the rest of the world. So the postponed 2020 Olympic Games in Japan had effectively been replaced by an Olympics of political decision-making and public health management, with the daily statistics keeping score in almost real time. So that's what I think is the first novelty, not the statistics themselves, but this scorecard, international scorecard aspect. Statistics and pandemics, of course, have been twins since at least the 16th century, when plague-stricken cities like London began to keep track of the diseases spread by publishing weekly bills of mortality, which listed the number of people dying from various causes of death. These numbers made the spread of the disease visible and gave some indication of the death toll, but by themselves, they did not make the plague into a crisis. For that, had to be made by the powers that be, for example, to close the city gates to foreign travelers, to quarantine households in which a member had been stricken by the plague, or to insist upon the immediate burial of those who had died from the plague. So sticking with the comparison to the bubonic plague that ravaged Europe from 1347 to 1720, we can discern another novelty in this pandemic, in the diagnosis of the crisis. Although estimates vary, the bubonic plague probably killed at least 50% of those populations it infected. Compare this mortality rate of at least 50% with the mortality rate of just under 1% for COVID-19. Now, some historical epidemiologists and notoriously some world leaders have wondered why COVID-19 counted as a crisis at all. Sure, it was 10 times more deadly than the annual flu, which has an average mortality rate of 0.1%, but it hardly compared to the plague or the cholera or any of the other pandemics that had ravaged the world in the past. I think this misses the point. The point was that the public perception of what constitutes a crisis, that is a situation justifying and indeed demanding drastic action, had shifted in especially the richer countries. And once again, it is perception of what is and is not acceptable that makes a crisis. A mortality rate that would have barely registered in 1821 or even 1921 had in 2021 became intolerable, just as, for example, infant mortality rates considered a fact of life in the mid-19th century are now considered intolerable in most developed nations. It became so intolerable that champions of fiscal austerity approved gigantic sums of money for public benefits. Air, ship, and automobile traffic almost ceased, and people were told not to venture outside their houses. The fact that such draconian edicts enjoyed, for the most part, compliance and support is a measure of a very important historical change in the threshold of crisis making and in the determination of the public to hold its leaders responsible for what in previous centuries would have been judged to be beyond human control. The very meaning of what the natural is has shifted. It is no longer considered natural for a pandemic to result in a 1% or more excess mortality, even if it is primarily the elderly who are affected. And it is no longer considered natural for political leaders to throw up their hands and plead force majeure. The radius of human responsibility has lengthened, and that means we can expect the number of crises, that is, situations perceived to demand immediate political action, that I think is destined to rise in the future. Finally, the role of science in this crisis. Once a situation has been made visible and diagnosed as a crisis, the pressing question is what is to be done and by whom? And it's hardly a novelty for political leaders to turn to experts at such moments. One of the first things that was done after the plague hit Italy in 1347 was to ask the medical faculty of the University of Paris for their best assessment of what the causes were. They chalked it up to an ill-starred conjunction of the planets. What's novel about the current crisis is the degree to which political leaders at least pretended to defer to scientific advice, and also the degree of international scientific cooperation that laid the groundwork for both tracking the pandemic and creating vaccines in record time. So I'll remind you of what you've all seen on your evening television news broadcasts: heads of states giving press conferences, flanked by scientists to whom, at least in public, they regularly deferred, all the hand-wringing discussions about the growing distrust of science, as evidenced by climate change skeptics and vaccine objectors, vanished almost overnight from the airwaves and the newspapers. Suddenly, scientists were being summoned to the corridors of power and became regular guests on TV talk shows. So the question I have, is this too good to last? Should it last? What do the public and science have to lose and gain from their intense interactions during the pandemic? So first, the scientists themselves. It must have been very pleasing, I think, for the virologists and epidemiologists and other biomedical researchers to have the general public hanging on their every word, not to mention the gusher of research funding and the I told you so satisfactions of having long warned the world in vain about the probability of just such a pandemic. But very soon, especially the scientists most exposed to the public eye, began to discover the nastier side of celebrity, particularly in the troll-infested social media. Leaders confronted with thorny moral dilemmas: save more lives at the price of ruining livelihoods. These leaders were all too happy to shift the responsibility to other shoulders, and the politically inexperienced scientists bore much of the brunt of the wrath that was bound to come from those disadvantaged by immediate emergency policies. Now, the scientists themselves, when they were pushed onto the public stage, discovered that the uncertainty and disagreements, which are an essential part of all scientific inquiry, could be exploited by political factions seeking support either for their own views or simply to undermine all authority. And here the far right and the far left made common cause, much to the dismay of the scientists. And because science journalists habitually erase all the uncertainty in the results that they report, the public was disagreeably surprised to see scientists disagreeing with one another in public. That is, at precisely the moment when the public craved scientific certainty, they were confronted with the spectacle of scientific uncertainty. And that brings me to the public side of this and a final question. Much of the public was, as I said, disconcerted by the spectacle of scientists openly disagreeing with each other about the advisability of wearing masks, the risks of contact transmission of the virus, and the merits of various medications to treat severe cases of COVID-19. And of course, the politicians were quick to exploit these disagreements to their own ends. And at least some part of the public concluded that science was just politics by other means. The inherent uncertainty of modern science, and this uncertainty is the precondition for scientific progress. If indeed today's scientific views were certain, that would be an end of scientific advances. This view of intrinsically uncertain scientific truth collided head-on with a view of truth which was still Platonic and somewhat theological, that is, of eternal, unchanging truths, not subject to constant revision by the latest new results published in The Lancet or Nature. So hence my question, with which I'll end: can the citizens, especially the citizens of rich countries, who have lowered the acceptable threshold of risk to 1% mortality, learn to live with the reality that scientific truths, the sturdiest truths we have, are intrinsically uncertain. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot, Rainey. And now the word is for Professor Adam Tooze. Thank you.
Thank you, Lino. We were asked to speak for between 7 and 10 minutes, and I will do my best to stick to that. So make rather brief remarks about the political economy of the crisis. I think, however, that they will fit quite nicely within the more capacious framework that Professor Daston has laid out for us in her opening remarks. I think the title is well chosen. Talking about making a crisis seems to me to be the right way to approach the experience we've just had. I don't think we should allow ourselves to be distracted by the current debate raging particularly intensely in the United States about the origins of the COVID crisis. Whether it's zoonotic mutation or escape from a lab, it seems to me that 2020 was evidently a crisis of second modernity, and it was an expression of what Ulrich Beck already in the 1980s called risk society. It holds true whether it's a manifestation of the Anthropocene, the sort of unbalanced development which the emerging infectious diseases paradigm isolated in the 1980s, from which those predictions by the virologists of impending doom were generated, or whether it's more like the Chernobyl accident that catapulted Beck's book to global prominence in 1986. After all, labs are not incidental, and labs are accidents waiting to happen, if not in China, then in America or Europe. So I think we should accept, broadly speaking, the fact that this is a human-induced event, whichever particular hypothesis we hold about the origins of the disease. I converge to that extent strongly with Professor Daston's point of view. I would, however, want to emphasize that it seems to me, and this is the citation of Ulrich Beck, who himself is, after all, doing little more than really summarizing the experience of science and politics in the 1970s, that this is at least a half century old as a problem and was problematized as such really by the classic discussions of the 1970s. It's a crisis that was made also in the sense, which is all too obvious in retrospect, that we grossly underestimated the need to prepare for it. So not only is it something about our modern existence which generated this crisis causally, but it's also true that we systematically underestimated its risks. And this has spawned endless recriminations in places like the US and the UK, notably, that pride themselves on their public health expertise and manifestly failed. This is the Olympics of governance that Professor Daston was referring to. I think, emphasize, and I think it's important in viewing this, and I imagine that Professor Daston was setting us up for this framing move, that whatever the ghastly failings of the Johnson and Trump administrations were, amply documented by investigative journalists, which itself is a genre of muckraking in modernity after all, that the blindness to the risks is generic. It appears to hold for Modi's administration in India just as much as it does for some ghastly person like Boris Johnson. Not for nothing, the follow-up to Beck's book in the late 80s, the follow-up to Risk Society, much less well-known, is called Organized Irresponsibility in loose translation. Indeed, if you define neoliberalism as being a logic of depoliticization, what is neoliberalism other than a gigantic project of the denial of responsibility? It's all about burying decision and the need for choice in various types of automatic mechanism. There was a denial, in other words, that made this worse in the face of evident risks generated by modernity. But I would also argue that even generalized awareness of risk didn't necessarily help if what you were doing was worrying about the wrong thing or something else very important that distracted you from focusing on what was about to blindside us. There was also a failure on the part of those, in short, who were deeply concerned with the anthropocenic risks to do with, for instance, climate change. I would count myself amongst that number because we simply didn't understand the intermeshing temporalities of the Anthropocene. I personally am very interested in military history. It's where my interest in history came from. And I couldn't help thinking all last year of Marc Bloch's Étrange Défaite, about the catastrophic defeat of the Third Republic at the hands of Nazi Germany in 1940. We were preparing for trench warfare, attritional struggle over climate change and the energy transition, and we were blindsided by a viral blitzkrieg, where the relevant temporality was weeks, days, and indeed hours in containing this disease. And I'm still concerned about this. I'm part of a UK reform commission whose mandate is to prepare a blueprint for national economic strategy for the coming decades, a hubristic and in some senses pointless enterprise. Even more so if its mandate is to devise a strategy to respond, in the words of the mandate, to structural change of climate and Brexit and recovery from COVID, as though COVID had not itself exposed a structural challenge of proportions even more dramatic than all the most apocalyptic predictions of climate change. Indeed, the UK economic crisis of 2020 was worse than any recession since the little ice age of the early 1700s. That's the worst recession in 300 years. There's no climate change we can calculate that is anywhere near as bad as what we actually experienced last year. Of course, there may be scenarios of climate change that are even worse, but we simply can't calculate them. There's no model that will generate an outcome worse than what we experienced last year. But even that apparently is not enough to shake loose our common understanding amongst the class of policymakers concerned with this problem of what is structural and what not. It's absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, it's sort of like almost goldfish-like process of amnesia. Furthermore, even those who did study the economics of pandemics prior to 2020, those who deserve ample credit for having done so, were strangely short-sighted about the sort of impact that they expected. They were all making the right case. In other words, we were chronically underinvesting in preparedness, but the way in which they did up their estimates massively understated the degree to which we were underpreparing. And this was crucially dictated by the fact, the profound prejudice on the part of Western societies that the problem was going to be in low-income and emerging market economies. In other words, and so the risks were, of course, much lower because they have much smaller GDPs, so the damage that can be done there is much smaller. And this fantasy persisted all the way into the first weeks of March. There's a notorious press conference staged by the European Commission at which they wanted to lecture the journalists about what they were going to do for Africa, even as Italy was shutting down. In short, we systematically underestimated the risks to the key hubs of the world economy, China, Europe, and the US, despite their massive entanglement. We thought Wuhan was the same as Chernobyl, even as, of course, it is a completely different beast. We systematically failed to appreciate what we actually have let ourselves into with globalization. But the basic reason, and this is my concluding point, that we can say that this was a crisis we made is that as far as the economy was concerned, as Professor Daston was emphasizing, it literally was. As bad as this pandemic was, this was far from being the most lethal thing that we could have encountered, or indeed, in fact, at the beginning of the epidemic, lethal things that we were going to encounter anyway in 2020, like the AIDS epidemic. It took months before COVID came close to the regular mortality generated by HIV/AIDS. And so we chose to shut down. Now, you can't say that, especially not in economic policy discourse, without immediately triggering a highly politicized discourse, a reactionary discourse, I think one has to say, about the nanny state. But that, too, is a profound misunderstanding because all the econometric evidence suggests that especially in rich countries, which weren't the only ones to shut down, and again, I think I would differ somewhat, the real novelty of March 2020 is that India shuts down. Not that Britain, I think, and Germany do. The real novelty is that India chooses that path as well. But setting that point aside, in the rich countries, the econometric evidence suggests that it was defensive reactions from the bottom up that actually drove the shutdown. So this wasn't something imposed from the top at all. The IMF's evidence on cell phone mobility is incredibly clear about this. It was a self-protective reaction by consumers, households, workers, and businesses that drove the shutdown. So even without a lockdown order, in other words, all we needed was global communication. All we needed was that graphic data, and it produced in society at all different levels a reaction to which governments responded by coordinating, facilitating, and indeed legalizing self-protective behavior, like in the end, famously, the shutdowns in New York schools, for instance. So to that extent, and there are neoclassical economists who will make this argument, this wasn't a crisis at all. GDP, as we all know, famously doesn't really measure what welfare is. And so if people are choosing to reduce GDP with a view to protecting themselves and their families, it's not an economic loss. That's a mismeasurement. This is an equilibrium adjustment to a supply shock. This is an argument that's actually made in neoclassical economics. And it's clearly fallacious, and it doesn't address two crucial things. And the first is the point so well made by Professor Daston, which is the very notion of crisis implies choice. The fact that you're being forced to make a very difficult choice is precisely what is a crisis. So the fact that there's evidence of choice, which neoclassicals will treat simply as therefore voluntarism, is in fact the very definition of crisis. And there are some crises, some choices rather, forced on you in a moment of crisis, which are profoundly challenging to identity. I think that's the other thing that we would want to perhaps add here. Some of the choices that we had to make were simply terrible, and it proves that our economies and political systems were not robust to having to make that kind of choice. And out of that then comes the recrimination and shock and crisis at all different levels, which we then think of as crisis. But even more significantly, and this is where I'll end, of course, it's completely simplistic to imagine that if you can identify moments of individual choice in a system and can see those as very powerful, that fully encompasses what happens. And the entire basis, presumably, for systematic social science and macroeconomics in particular, is that the consequences of those kind of localized actions are not, in fact, encompassed within the individual choice, but generate massive spillover, multiplier, knock-on effects, which then have systematic consequences which go well beyond the individual choice. And the one place that we saw this most spectacularly was in the financial markets, which begin to run to safety on a huge scale in late February, weeks before shutdowns became actual in the West, and produced a massive shock in the global financial system by March 9th, the week starting March 9th. An absolutely classic collective action problem with everyone basically trying to get through the same emergency exit. And the consequence is to shake the global financial system in a way which is even more profound in many ways than 2008. This doesn't become evident because to stabilize the US Treasury market, which is the foundation, the last really residual element of stability in the global financial system, the central banks had to engage in truly gigantic interventions, again dwarfing what was done in 2008, in fact, by an order of magnitude. In other words, they were buying per week as much as Ben Bernanke's team were buying per month and more. In late March, they were buying $1 million of assets a second, tens of billions of dollars a day. To stabilize the US Treasury system. A further indication, I think, of the sense in which we now live in a system which, if it's as balanced as well as a fast-moving bicycle, I think we'd be somewhat optimistic. It's a ramshackle device stabilized by a continuous series of interventions, all of which, and I would agree wholeheartedly with Professor Daston on this, are predictive of more to come along these same lines.
Thank you very much. And I believe you're writing a book about this. So thanks for the effort of comprising all this in just 10 minutes and also for the effort of already, thanks for the effort of already bridging with Professor Daston's intervention, which is preparing already the dialogue. Professor Alexander, please, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Well, I've enjoyed listening to my predecessors. I think that my perspective is one of drawing attention to the meaning-making aspect of this crisis. For example, that Lorraine touched on in terms of turning a disaster into a crisis and the perception element of it. As I understand what happened, I would call it a collective trauma, a societal traumatic experience, both within small units like families, of course, which are also collectivities, nations, regions, and to some degree globally. And as this sense of crisis exploded, what happened is a conflict over how to narrate this. Who were, for example, what exactly was happening? This was an object of continuous debate and disagreement. Who were the perpetrators, in a sense, of this trauma? Who were the victims of this trauma? And what could we do to prevent this from ever happening again? I think that these questions are not answered. I mean, they're never fully answered in any certainly scientific way, but societally, they're debated, and they have tremendous consequences in terms of social reform, the fate of neoliberalism, etc. So, I mean, just to look at the United States, if there hadn't been this continuous debate and narration, Trump would still be president. And who knows what the fate of this country would have been. The fact that Biden was able to win and was able to create a sense of solidarity is very much a result of a cultural process that changed the United States in a way that was completely unexpected. So, for example, what happened? Well, people died. Many people died. Many people got sick. But it was possible, and conservatives here advanced this throughout, which is that it's not a big deal. This is just happening to a very small number of people, less than 1%. It's not happening in our state. It's not happening in our region, et cetera, et cetera. And this was, in other words, a claim about reality that was taken very seriously, and statistics could sometimes bolster this view, sometimes challenge it, but the statistics had to become signifieds in a discourse that was made powerfully by some people and others. One of the issues that was consuming people was not the level of actual death and disease, but had our society, this is actually a failure of society. Did this show that society was really made up of selfish people, selfish units, and this mushroomed into a question of heroes who cared about other people, like nurses, doctors, lower, less privileged people who carried out their duties anyway, picking up garbage, delivering pizzas, or were they isolated and didn't represent the mainstream of the world, which was selfishness, everybody looking out for themselves? Who were the victims? This was and still is, I think, subject to a tremendous different kind of narrations and arguments. I mean, are the victims just individuals? Are the victims, is everybody in this together? Or is, in this country, are less privileged people by far greater victims? And depending on who are the victims, how you answer that, leads to what we might do, how we could reconstruct society. Who are the perpetrators? In this country, the idea that the Chinese were the perpetrators was a giant argument, and that it didn't come from the United States. So the United States could remain pure, good, innocent. The whole country was a victim. But in addition, on the left and center, a narrative developed, which is who perpetrated this? Trump, neoliberalism. That it wasn't just a medical crisis; it was a crisis of a governmental and societal regime that had destroyed the government. The ability to reconstruct and to create solidarity, to create protection. So in a way, this all led to, I think, a series of deep existential anxieties, which is, are we all in this together? Or are we just in competition with one another over resources? How much do we care about victims? Are we willing to make sacrifices for others? What about the people who are dying at a much greater rate? Now this is raised to the global level in terms of Africa, in terms of Latin America, in terms of poorer countries, and the West is facing this as a crisis of selfishness again. So I think that this trauma raised issues of solidarity and empathy, and that it opened up, and it's still opening up, I think, although it's impossible to do justice to, even if I knew it, to all the different national environments of this discussion. But here in the United States, I think that this broadened an experience of solidarity and created a basis for putting neoliberalism in the back window. I think that Biden's election and his willingness to embrace gigantic government spending and to reconstruct racial. Of course, in the United States, the COVID crisis occurred at the same time as the racial crisis, beginning in the early summer of 2020. So I in what I've said here, I wanted to draw attention to the competition over how to narrate who are the subjects, who are the objects, what are the implications for our relationship to one another.
Okay, so thank you very much as well, Professor Alexander, and this was great. We are just on time, perhaps a little bit late, but we have time enough for that 10 to 15 minute dialogue among yourselves. I don't want to organize it in any way, just let you express your ideas as you please. So maybe in the same at the beginning, but also, I mean, do whatever you intervene whenever you see fit. So, thank you.
Well, perhaps I could begin with questions for both Professor Tooze and Professor Alexander. So, first to Professor Alexander, thank you very much. My question is, do you think that the plot line was preordained, that it has to be a narrative of perpetrators and victims, as opposed to, for example, all of us struggling against a common foe, namely the virus? I was struck by the degree to which various national leaders, not in the United States, but in Europe, have anthropomorphized the virus. Boris Johnson, most notoriously, when he said it was like a mugger who you had to wrestle to the ground. And it leads me to also a question for Professor Tooze, which is, I was struck, because I happened to be visiting Cambridge when this all began, by the difference between, in one way, the US reaction and the UK reaction. The UK reaction was very much shaped by the fact that there was a shared health system, the NHS. And very soon, the rhetoric became not one of perpetrators and victims, but rather one of save the NHS. So that the basis for solidarity was not necessarily empathy, but rather a view about a common good. And I wonder whether you think that that makes a difference in terms of the response to the crisis.
I'll just address I think that, let's say there's if a country or a region would say the perpetrator is the virus, this would still create a strong narrative of trauma and victim. And the narrative would be one that would avoid political polarization and cultural obliteration of other people. So that I would still, I think, as you would also perhaps understand this as a cultural construction of a crisis. Yet I don't think, and maybe that was, or certainly that was one of the narratives that permeated this. But in England, in Britain, Boris Johnson was also held to be an evil buffoon who was taking Britain down a path of vulnerability. And certainly in the United States, there was this other way. But I don't know about on the continent as much. Somebody else would have to tell me.
Yeah, I'll just say that in every Berlin train station, there is shouted out at you, wear a mask and zusammen gegen den Virus, together against the virus. So that's the line.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's tempting to focus on that difference because, I mean, between the US and the UK, because the NHS has acquired this totemic status in Britain in recent years. My friend David Edgerton has a strong line in saying it's, as it were, one of the few national institutions that continue, in fact, to hold the UK together. And there is a critical reading of this, which is that in terms of policy choices, it was quite disastrous because, in a sense, what the British pursued was an absolutely radical policy of flattening the curve, which is, was a discourse shaped profoundly by studies done by Imperial College for good reason. And the crisp focus, if you like, of policymakers on enabling the survivability of this highly centralized national health system had rather perverse side effects in that they didn't really properly address the spillover effects of, for instance, dumping bunches of untested elderly patients into the care system, which isn't part of the protected envelope. So you have an insider-outsider problem in Britain, which is very acute because the NHS has this totemic status. And I think it is tempting to say, obviously, things are radically different in America because it has this, grotesque, ramshackle, incomplete, private, ghastly, overpriced, useless healthcare system. But living in a city like New York, I have to say that the differences were much less pronounced than I would have expected. Because at a state level and in democratic run places like New York, which were faced with an absolutely out of control crisis, in March, I think the fine divisions between which particular bit of the healthcare system you were in and which particular insurance card you had largely disappeared in practice in the heat of that moment. At least at the level of cultural sociology, the sense that we were a city totally dependent on our ambulance drivers, our nurses, and our doctors was omnipresent, totally shared, and every bit as consensual. I think in many ways more consensual. And New Yorkers were much more disciplined about wearing masks than the UK population until very recently when we were immunized. Through to the beginning of this year, my family in the UK are mask resistors, despite being molecular biologists. And in, New York, it was just social conformism that you wore a mask and everyone. So the divisions have softened in a remarkable way. The problem, of course, is the units of comparison. It doesn't make sense to compare England with the United States because they're just unlike units. And in the United States, is 30 million people. So if you compare, if you do the basic sort of sensible region for region comparisons, there are plenty of bits in the US which I think are quite like the UK in practice. And then there are bits of the US for which there is no European equivalent, essentially. And the obvious analogues are in Brazil or in Mexico, where you have very similar patterns of total rejection. There are leaders, and by no means only Trump, who were able to simply deny the reality of this. I mean, AMLO in Mexico and Bolsonaro in Brazil are both very important examples.
And Modi too.
Of flat out denial. Yeah. I wanted to ask a question of Jeff. It's funny listening to you talk about it because I ended up writing lines incredibly like that in this book. And I'm not being a cultural sociologist. I felt embarrassed doing it, because I just felt a little bit out of my depth. And the concept which kept coming to mind as somebody who's been long interested in military history, military cultural history, sociology, is this question of the heroic discourse. And there are memes, perhaps rather flat, but nevertheless quite interesting, about the emergence of the post-heroic society. We have professionalized militaries, we have endless wars fought by people who aren't the mass of the population. In Germany, of course, this is a standing question about where military Germany went, where have all the soldiers gone? And one can see the attractions from a kind of liberal modernization point of view of the end of hubris, the end of, it was part of Francis Fukuyama's diagnosis of the end of history was that that the hubristic pursuit of individual glory was obsolete. But in moments like 2020, it also then makes it kind of arbitrary who are heroes and who isn't a hero, and what do we owe heroes. There's a sort of, it struck me that there was part of the problem was we no longer had the general availability of a heroic discourse that, for instance, sustained total war societies in World War II. Because there it's quite commonplace. I mean, dying for the economy, which seemed an obscenity in America in 2020, was literally what every European in a total war economy did every day they went to work. Was you died for the economy. You died for the economy because the economy was the war effort, and you put yourself at risk in a factory of being bombed for the war economy. And that discourse was just not available, it seemed, or couldn't be mustered coherently. You could do it exactly as you said, kind of patchily, but then it was very unclear whether a teacher really should be heroic, whereas a Duane Reade, apothecary worker was supposed to be heroic. Like, where were the lines?
I don't read it. I mean, this is a good discussion. I don't accept the notion of, the rationalization of the world through Max Weber's or whatever. So I think that heroism is always an available discourse. And it's part of a strong kind of romantic narrative, let's say, about sacrifice. And the way I saw this was that it was the people did make the healthcare workers into tremendous heroes, sacrificing every day. This was a continuous discourse of clapping in New York and other places. To me, it was very inspiring, but I don't want to talk about myself as a citizen, but I found this fascinating sociologically, and then the question is, could it be extended to the lower class people who, and I found that what they did was often, there were great efforts to transform it into a hero discourse too, like the pizza guy, the trash collector, the people who collected groceries and brought them to people's houses. And to me, that was very significant in terms of the possibilities of expanding solidarity. Reminded me in a way of, the argument, of course, that the working class men sacrificing in World War II is what helped usher in the welfare state afterward. And I kind of think that happened to some degree in the United States.
Can I ask, if you have questions or whatever you want to say, but I have questions to maybe all of you, but maybe more particular Professor Daston and Professor Tooze, which is, Professor Daston, you were talking about the role of science, and by science you mainly meant, I think, epidemiology. This is the one science that politicians were referring to as the ones in charge, basically. But I was interested about the relationships with other science, which is the one that Adam Tooze was talking about, which is economics, right? So basically, how mobilized for this crisis, and what have been their changing relative roles to one another?
Right. Well, I'll be really interested in what Professor Tooze says about this. So I should express a heretical view. I am quite skeptical about the scientific credentials of economics, which I think has a prediction record, at least if you go 6 months into the future, of about astrology. So I think that what happened especially between about March and June 2020 was a complete refutation of most of the doctrines of economics, in which it turned out that there's such a thing as a money tree. I have vivid recollections of the notoriously tight-fisted German government going on TV. These are the people who had preached austerity to countries like Spain and Italy and Portugal for years, saying, I have a bazooka, by which he meant, I mean, this is a very ill-chosen metaphor for a German politician, but I have a bazooka and we're just going to throw money at this. We're just going to throw money at this. So my view about if this were an Olympics not of public crisis management, but rather of which sciences were doing well and which were doing badly, I think that the virologists came out very well. The epidemiologists, there was a real problem with their modeling and not just Imperial College. Not entirely their fault, but they did not, I think, come out flying all pennants. But the economists, I think, disgraced themselves as if they needed to disgrace themselves again.
It's extremely unusual for me to find myself in this position, but I think you make me feel defensive about the economists. Broadly speaking, clearly this is a triumph for molecular biology. This is a triumph for virology. My dad died in the middle of all of this. He was a leading first generation molecular biologist, and he died happily. Because he didn't die of COVID, he died of a heart attack, and he was vaccinated with a molecular biology vaccine. And that entire generation of molecular biologists just watched in amazement at what we were able to do. And we should celebrate that, of course. I think also with the epidemiologists, I was going to add this as an amendment to Professor Daston's remarks, is that after all, what really moved mountains in the end were not just the data and the graphics, but the predictions. It was actually the Imperial College predictions in mid-March of where we would end up unless we locked down that really changed the world in the decision-making processes in Britain and the United States. And we have very good, as robust evidence as historians will ever have of the influence of that data. We know Fauci and Co. described the moment at which it arrived on Trump's desk, and combined with some very graphic television footage from Queens, we think it changed his mind about the American lockdown, crucially. So in a sense, were they accurate or not doesn't really matter. They probably drove the decision-making process in the right direction. It was performative stuff, right? So I think that kind of discipline has a rather ambiguous impact here. I think I really would insist that economics this time around didn't get in the way. This is actually a moment in which economists cleared out, and in fact were cleared out. I mean, what one can very clearly say is that it was a defeat for economics in the sense that they were never asked. If you look at, the institutional power centres. So normally you'd think of the British state as governed by the UK Treasury all the way back to the 18th century. And it, I think, is the case that in none of the key decisions in early March, anyone from the UK Treasury was asked what was going to happen and what was going to go on. And that in the history of UK governance is extraordinarily unusual for them not to be calling the shots. Once the path was then set, I think it's very unfair to say they failed. No, on the contrary, what they did was to recognize that this was a quasi-war economy, John Maynard Keynes' how to pay for the war type moment. And in fact, they're very skillful now at devising QE type programs. And there was remarkably little objection from any serious side in the economics profession to what was done. And a lot of rather constructive thinking went on in key central banks and treasuries around this problem. And a lot of lessons have been learned from the austerity phase after 2010. So, does that mean that they're going to embark on a wholesale transformation of capitalism and thereby reduce the anthropocenic risks? No, evidently not. But that's not a problem of academics. That's not a question of economic intellectuals. That's a question of massively entrenched power and interests. And frankly, what we like to eat and the difficulty of persuading hundreds of millions of rich people to stop eating meat. I think, the economics profession was in a sense kind of quick to respond, as quick as any other group of experts in this moment. And in part because they do in fact recognize that the handling of the aftermath of 2008-9 was severe, and speaking to an audience based in Spain, nowhere more so, of course, than in Europe, and the tragic consequences of decisions made after 2010 for Spain principally, as the largest victim of the Eurozone crisis, have in fact have a significant impact on European policy discourse. And though the initial attempt to get Corona bonds started, which was pushed by the Spanish government, much to its credit, that failed. Ultimately, the Germans were won around. And again, persistent effort, the slow digging, the slow drilling of boards by German economists of the centre and left has made a huge difference. And the fact that SPD control the finance ministry has made a big difference.
Yes.
So no, I think I would
Olaf Scholz did make a big difference. Yeah. Can I ask you just, is there time for me to ask a question about this? So the question is, I do agree with you that once the economists had decided that this was a state of exception, like unto a war economy, they had a way at least of framing it, even if I think that their actual decisions were, compared to those of the virologists and even the epidemiologists, an order of magnitude less consequential and less helpful. But the question is, does that very framing of this as a state of exception really imply that the lasting impact of this is going to be minimal? So you began your remarks, I think, quite trenchantly about how wildly unprepared almost all nations of the world were for what happened. And it could easily have been any of the other catastrophes which might have happened. And that leads me to ask, what does it mean if we still think in terms of such periods as anomalies, as opposed to the new normal, as opposed to a kind of fitful rhythm of such explosions, and which are framed, at least at first, as, it's an anomaly, it's an exception, very soon we will be back to normal. What does that say about not just the science of economics, but about politicians, about all of us?
Yeah, I'm just one more time on this. I don't think there are many economists who are really engaged in a knowledge Olympics with molecular biology. Right? I should say I teach at humble enough. Chicago. There are some. The ones who are worth taking seriously as human beings are humble enough to know the difference, and the ones who aren't, frankly, are head cases. But I think it's really interesting, and this is the Schmittian problem, right? This is a problem. This is the problem of politics fundamentally, and this is perhaps also one of the reasons why the domain of economics and social science is fundamentally different from that of natural science. This is an inherently political question that you've opened up. And it will play out accordingly. And as it were, the question of who has the power to decide whether this is the normal or not is the pivotal question of the current moment. And the election in Germany, in some senses right now, is precisely about that question, right? The Green Party is trying to say, folks, wake up, smell coffee. This is our normality and it's radical. This has been their message since 16 or something, right? That realism is radicalism now. And that, for most of us is a highly compelling diagnosis. Whether or not you can get the Poles and the Dutch to agree on this as the basis for a rewriting of the European fiscal rules is another question. There aren't many macroeconomists who will tell you that there's any way back to the Maastricht criteria normality right now. That's a political choice. And what we've seen in one of the areas that was fundamentally haunted by the promise of normalization, using precisely that term, is central banking policy, which after the radical interventions of 08, 09, 10 was dominated by the discourse of normalization. Again, I think you'd have to look long and hard to find a serious central banker right now who thinks of the trajectory from here in terms of normalization. From here on in, it's scrambled, it's a broken play. We increment and we improvise our way forward bit by bit. And that's as much as you can hope for in this domain.
May I just add one thing to that there's been various studies of Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea. Why did they do so well? And basically, the way I understand it is that because of the SARS scare, which made them feel extremely vulnerable, and they were very vulnerable, they reconstructed and built collective memory. And so when this new event happened, they were able to respond almost routinely and carefully. I predict that we will not be unprepared, that this will become a new collective memory, that there will be Taiwan-like responses, not everywhere, not in Brazil, who knows? But in many countries, so I think that this is a collective learning experience that won't go unacknowledged, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. I have some questions coming from the web, but I know some of you need to leave at sharp the time. So maybe let me ask one final question. Is one question by Javier Romero Poveda, which is, it fits very nicely in what you were saying. How do we prepare for the next one, right? And I want to make it a little more complicated and ask, imagine that politicians in different parts of the world took for granted all that you're saying, right? That history matters, that culture matters, all the things that you've been saying. That is to say, imagine that instead of talking about the power of epidemiologists and virologists and economists, we were talking about the power of the human and social sciences. Imagine for a minute that's the framework with which politicians approach political action. How would that change what they do to prepare for the next crisis?
If I might answer first, simply because I really do have to leave in 60 seconds.
Absolutely.
I mean, I've touted Ulrich Beck's prescience several times already, and I mean this point quite seriously as a historian, that I do think it's wrong to think about the shock of 2020 as novel. It really was a crisis foretold for the best part of half a century. All of us, I think, on the call are sufficiently old to perhaps not simply recognize the historicity of this, but we have been living for a half century under the shadow of this prophecy. And one of the suggestions that Beck, after all, made for escaping the dilemmas of risk society, and particularly dilemmas of the interaction between science and politics in risk society, is to unleash science to an even more radical degree than it currently is unleashed. In other words, to decouple it from immediate imperatives and to fund it at a level, essentially, that enabled it to truly unfold its potential. So, I mean, I think that the just a pragmatic conclusion from precisely what Professor Daston's been amplifying, in other words, the incredible speed and power of scientific breakthrough as opposed to our very limited ability to engineer social responses, is to say, let's play to our strong suit. Let's actually spend serious money. And by which I mean quantities of money that dwarf anything that we currently spend on basic research, that are the sorts of money that we spend on, well, let's start with pet food, which is $35 billion a year in the United States, and then ramp it up from there, right? Really serious amounts of money in expanding the frontiers of what we can do, because it just seems like we need magic bullets because we're so bad at the other more complex solutions. And if we can be much quicker at generating magic bullets, is obviously not a foolproof scenario, and it obviously plays into all sorts of fantasies that modernity has long generated. But frankly, in the disillusioned aftermath of this crisis, that would be that would clearly be my recommendation. Just go big, go really big. Do NASA, and then do NASA even bigger than where we were in the early 60s, and see where we end up. But anyway, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm so sorry to have to go. You all know the dilemmas of these Zoom meetings. Thank you so much, and stay well.
Thank you very much, Professor Tooze, and don't worry, we will be closing anyway very, very soon. So thank you. Who else wants to jump in for this last question, or anything else you want to say as perhaps your next to last or even last intervention?
Well, it might be interesting to say that I'm not on board with Adam's suggestion of that science will save us. I think that leadership will save us, and a sense of solidarity and rationality. If people had immediately shut down, as they did in Taiwan and Singapore, wear masks, there would have been no outbreaks of this worldwide illness. But in fact, they didn't. Leaders wouldn't take responsibility. There was denial, splitting, all sorts of blame narratives. I don't see the solution. I hope that the greatest vaccines ever continue to be produced. But there's always going to be new dangerous problems that are produced. So for me, the answer is in a sense of societal responsibility, shared suffering, empathy, and then some kind of responsible leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I confess I'm tempted by Adam Tooze's solution to the problem, but I have to recognize the justice of what Jeffrey Alexander just said, which is, first of all, it's completely unclear where the next disaster is coming from. We could say climate change, but there are a lot of sciences out there, and you first have to make a decision as to which horses you are going to bet on. But even that won't really solve the problem. It's, I think, fundamentally a problem, not only of solidarity and empathy, I agree with that, but also of trust in institutions. Those countries that fared best were those that, in general, trusted their institutions. And there's no way that science alone, no matter how pyrotechnical, can replace the kind of trust the Taiwanese, for example, and the Finns have in their governments. If you want people to follow the dictates of science, not just pay for them, but follow them, there's going to have to be a great deal of work done to create and restore that lost trust.
Okay, that was great, Professor Alexander and Professor Daston, and really thank you very much for taking the time to discuss these important matters with us and for taking questions from both me and the audience, and most importantly from each other, which is a rare luxury we have the pleasure of enjoying. So yeah, very best wishes from Madrid. And I think now is going to close the act Juan del Llano, who together with me is co-editor of Sociedad, entre pandemias, and he is also the president of Fundación Gaspar Casal. So thank you very much. Have a good evening.